Um, I'm here in Houston, been here for about 20 years. I saw a post online from Adrian about, I think it was Adrian, who said something about looking for people who had ideas about adult education. And I said, I'm happy to volunteer some time and teach something that I love. So we're going to get right into it. I think we have about an hour, and we'll have time for questions kind of interspersed in between and a little bit at the end. I apologize for not looking directly at the camera the whole time. I've got a couple screens in front of me, one of which has a bunch of notes. And I think that the animation in my presentation doesn't operate quite as smoothly as I would like over Zoom. It's wonderful if you want to turn your camera on. It certainly makes me feel like I'm not just talking to an empty room, but I've been on enough Zoom calls over the past 9 months to know that sometimes I just don't want my camera on. But of course, you'll need to take a look at the screen. We've got lots and lots of things to look at. So today we're going to examine the Jewish humor and cultural references in Mad Magazine. And right away, I'm going to issue a little bit of a warning. There are probably some things that we're going to talk about that might offend you. And if they don't offend you, they would probably offend somebody else that you know. So keep that in mind. So Mad Magazine started as a full-color comic book in August 1952, and it essentially ceased publication just a couple years ago in June 2018. Here's a recent issue. Evidently, Trump was in everything, and that was the big selling point of that issue, that Trump wasn't in that issue. Of course, he was in that issue at some point. So in the early 1950s, there was a growing fear that sex and violence in comic books contributed to juvenile delinquency. And in response to a congressional inquiry into the comic book industry and the popularity of this book, Seduction of the Innocent, the comic book industry established what's called the Comics Code Authority to self-censor their publications. But Mad Magazine really didn't want to censor themselves, and so they stopped publishing in color and they turned into a black and white publication, which essentially made them no longer a comic book. And so that's how they could continue to be offensive and really do parody without worry. The other thing is that they did not accept any advertising from 1957 until 2001 because they felt that that would also give them more freedom to satirize without repercussions. Mad Magazine was started by this guy, William Gaines, who was Jewish. His father was Max Gaines, who is seated there on the right with a very interesting group of people here. On the left is William Marston, who created Wonder Woman, who's certainly very much in the news now with the movies, and a couple other people who were involved with Wonder Woman. So Max Gaines, William Gaines's father, is credited with inventing the comic book. He essentially took the Sunday funnies and he saddle stapled them into a book and sold them, and all of a sudden you have a comic book being sold at newsstands. So Mad Magazine has had a very, very long, unusually long tenure of editors, artists, and writers. 36 of them have contributed to 100 or more issues. And of the Jewish artists, Dave Berg contributed to more than 300 issues, and Al Jaffe, both of whom we'll talk about in a little bit, but Al Jaffe contributed to almost 500 issues of this magazine, which was only published monthly. So Harvey Kurtzman was the editor. He was Jewish. He was the editor until 1956, but just a few years. And then Al Feldstein was the editor from 57 to 84, an incredibly long time. And you can see a couple things here. Alfred E. Newman dressed up like Hitler. We'll get to that in a little bit. And at that point, Mad Magazine circulation peaked at 2.1 million. Nick Meglin and John Ficarra edited together until 2004, and then Ficarra edited alone until 2018. So before we take a look at Mad's Jewish content, we need to understand why we find things to be funny. And the best theory about what makes things funny is the benign violation theory. There are lots of theories about what makes things funny, but this is the best. Humor emerges when something seems wrong or unsettling, which is a violation, but is actually benign. So, for example, this explains why the unexpected sight of a friend falling downstairs, which is a violation of expectations, is funny only if the friend is not seriously injured, which is a benign outcome. So you have to have this nice mix of benign violation. And so an example of that is Archie Comics #1. It's unexpected, it's a violation because Archie jumps over these 2 barrels on his skates, but there's a hole in the ice. You know he's gonna fall in the water, but it's funny because you know he's gonna be okay because he has to appear in the next comic book. So that's a benign violation. It also explains puns. Puns are a violation of linguistic rules. And it explains why we laugh when we're tickled, because it's a perceived physical violation with no real danger, so it's benign. But it also explains why you cannot tickle yourself, because tickling yourself isn't a violation. And it explains why a stranger cannot tickle you, because a stranger touching you is not at all benign. So the benign violation theory also does a good job of explaining why some things are not funny. A joke that's too benign is boring. If something is too much of a violation, it's offensive. And it also explains why some jokes that were funny in the past are not funny today, because our sense of what constitutes a violation has changed. So for example, this movie, Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles, could probably not be released today because the jokes in it are no longer benign. They are offensive, the way that African Americans are referred to, lots of stereotypes. The public probably wouldn't tolerate that today. It also explains why some jokes are funny to some people, but not to other people. Perhaps Holocaust jokes or jokes about sex. Depending on what you consider to be benign, something can be funny to you or to somebody else. We also learned that some jokes are not funny because we don't know the historical context. So if you take a look at this is a splash page from Mad #4, The Shadow. So it's a parody of the Shadow, the comic character. And if you take a look up here, we have a bar with a bunch of criminals in it. And on the television is the Kefauver Crime Committee. So evidently the hearings are being televised. So this is a little bit of an obscure thing, especially if you're younger than probably 60 years old. But the Kefauver Crime Committee was actually the United States Senate Special Committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce, which is a real mouthful. But it was called the Kefauver Committee because it was chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. And this is the committee that is highlighted in the movie Godfather Part 2, when they're in the Senate hearing. So the joke that you need to understand, and you need to have the historical context, is that you've got this committee on television looking into organized crime being played in a bar where there are a bunch of organized crime criminals having beer. So again, you need to know the historical context. It's also interesting that Senator Kefauver chaired the United States Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency, which dealt with comic books at which William Gaines testified. So the point is that Jewish historical, religious, and cultural knowledge is the key to understanding much of the Jewish humor in Mad Magazine. If you don't understand the historical, religious, and cultural context of the joke, then you won't know if it's a violation and you cannot determine if it's benign. And so gaining that understanding means that you need to learn a little bit about Yiddish kite. But before we learn about Yiddish kite, let's all wave hello to Sandy Borak, who is my mom. Hi, Mom. You can mute yourself now. I'm in Houston. My mom's in Los Angeles. We see each other more often on Zoom than we used to traveling on airplanes. So Yiddishkeit is the Jewishness of Ashkenazi Jews in general and Yiddish-speaking Jews of Eastern and Central Europe in particular. And Mad's writers and the artists were immersed in Yiddishkeit. Mad editor Al Feldstein once said, "My writers were all Jewish boys from Jewish families in urban centers." So Harvey Kurtzman, who wrote virtually all of the stories for the first few years of Mad magazine and many of the following years until he left in 1956, established Mad's Yiddishkeit in the very first issue. And Will Elder, who was born William Eisenberg, drew many of those early stories, and he was just as instrumental. So Kurtzman's parents were educated, non-observant Jewish immigrants from Ukraine. His father, though, joined a Christian Science church and actually died when Kurtzman was 4 because he relied on prayer to cure a bleeding ulcer. So Kurtzman's mom remarried to a Russian Jewish immigrant less than a year later. Kurtzman didn't have a bar mitzvah, but he attended Camp Kinderland, which advertises itself as a camp with a conscience. It was founded by the Workmen's Circle. And at the time that Kurtzman attended the camp, it was the official summer camp of the Jewish section of the International Workers' Order, a Communist Party fraternal organization. And Yiddishkeit was central to all of these types of organizations, and Kurtzman expressed his Yiddishkeit through his writing. So the two of them, Kurtzman and Elder, attended the New York High School of Music and Art with Al Jaffe, Al Feldstein, and a few other artists who drew for Mad magazine. And they attended really when that high school was just established. Kurtzman and Elder also wrote and drew the comic strip Little Annie Fanny that some of you might remember from Playboy magazine from 1962 until 1988. And what's really interesting about so many of these artists that are famous to us in Mad magazine and in other places, these artists of the mid-20th century, is that many of them got their start drawing very risque cartoons for men's publications. So Kurtzman and Elder grew up with New York families where their parents spoke and argued in Yiddish, both of them, but neither of them understood Yiddish. So if you're kind of like my generation, who grew up in the 1960s and the early 1970s, it's a little bit of a familiar thing, second generation families of immigrant parents. I remember my grandparents speaking, especially my grandmother on my mom's side, speaking Yiddish and didn't know what it meant. And so for Kurtzman, these were simply funny words with a curse thrown in once in a while. And so he put the funniest sounding words into Mad magazine. So right here in the very first issue, we have a story called Ganef, right? And of course, we know that a Ganef is a thief. There we go, Yiddish and Hebrew. Now, one of the things that is in Mad magazine is what's called chicken fat. And these are these little tiny drawings that populate the entire early issues of Mad magazine and even a little bit later also. So Will Elder, who drew this stuff, would say that the term came out of what we both knew were the parts of the strip that gave it more flavor but did very little to advance the storyline. That's what chicken fat does. It advances the flavor of the soup. And as we all know, now, too much chicken fat will kill you. So you might leave it at that. We've got these funny little drawings that appear in the corners of Mad magazine. We'll call it chicken fat, except there's also a lot more that has to do with that. And it's all about this Yiddishkeit stuff. So what you need to know about chicken fat, there's a little bit more, is that it comes from schmaltz. And we all know schmaltz, right? Schmaltz is rendered chicken fat. And the thing to remember about schmaltz is that Jews ate a lot of schmaltz because Jews can't mix milk and meat. So what do you use? You can't use butter, so you use schmaltz, clarified chicken fat instead of the butter. Now, I remember schmaltz and this stuff from grivenes, which are chicken things. My mom is totally laughing here because there's a picture of my grandpa Fred. My grandpa Fred was born, this is on my dad's side, was born in Hungary. And I remember as a little kid, whenever I walked into his house, he lived alone until he was in his 90s. he had a little plastic baggie on the counter in his kitchen of grivenes. And I would run straight into the kitchen and reach my hand in that disgusting bag, pull out some and chew on it, not realizing as a 4 or 5-year-old what was going on. And of course, here's a lovely picture of what it looks like, I guess, if you were to serve it in a upscale restaurant. It was truly disgusting looking back on it. And I can say that after having been a vegetarian now for about 40 years. So chicken fat was really a part of this whole Yiddish kite thing until, of course, Crisco appeared in 1911. And when Crisco appeared, all of a sudden, you didn't have to use schmaltz for cooking. So the chicken fat and the Yiddish words that were real or that they were invented appeared in Mad magazine, and they influenced American culture and language. So let's take a look at a couple more pieces of chicken fat. Here's another example of a story, Dragnet, of course, a spoof on the show Dragnet. In this particular comic, the detectives are searching for a villain whose name is Glotz. And as they go on their search, they encounter a Swift's kosher ham. So right there, you have a little bit of a Jewish joke there. Swift's is a company that still makes ham, although it's not owned by Swift's anymore, but I think it was started in the 1860s. As they're on their journey, they encounter this guy who's eating a bunch of stuff, a lot of non-kosher things you can see littered on the table, but we've got signs left and right about how they've got borscht. Borscht everywhere. So borscht, of course, is also a Jewish dish. This is what it's supposed to look like, again, in an upscale restaurant. We also have Mandrake the Magician. Don't know if you remember this comic strip, but Mad satirized this also with Manduck the Magician. Here we have Charles Atlas, who has I Was Raised on Chicken Fat on his shorts there. And then as they continue their search, you can see this lovely woman sitting on a park bench with some incredible stereotypical and offensive things going on, but a box that says Manischewitz. I am not sure how many people who read Mad Magazine back in the 1950s really knew what Manischewitz was. Then there's this story, a spoof on what it means to be eating in a restaurant. And in one panel, we have this, today's special egg for young with gefilte fish. Gefilte fish, of course, a Jewish food made of extending rotten fish parts with stale breadcrumbs. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time today to talk about why Jews eat Chinese food. It's actually really, really fascinating. Now, some of the chicken fat can be truly obscure. So for example, here we're back again at the Shadow. Now, if you know the Shadow, you know that the Shadow's alias is Lamont Cranston. But in the Mad parody, he is Lamont Shadow Skeety Boom Boom. So Shadow Skeety Boom Boom, you might think that's just a silly name that they made up, but if you do, then you don't know about this guy, Aaron Lebedeff. Aaron Lebedeff was a Yiddish theater star who arrived in America in 1920 and became an overnight star of the Yiddish theater. And on this album, I don't know if you can hear. Can you hear? So from Bim 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 Bomb, you get Shadow Skeety Boom Boom. I don't know if that's actually the case, but at any rate, it sure makes sense, and it's nice to imagine. So here we have a parody of Popeye called Poop Eye, and here the same thing. You can see that in one panel we have Montgomery's Kosher Hamburger Shops, which I have tried endlessly to track down and have not found. And then something really obscure. First of all, we have Superman appearing, who's instead of his S, it says chicken fat, or it says Fleischmann's yeast. Why would it say Fleischmann's yeast? So Charles and Maximilian Fleischmann were Jewish, and the compressed yeast cakes that they invented in 1868 were familiar to Eastern European Jewish women who used similar type of yeast before coming to America. And Fleischmann's yeast was really used by Jews because there was a competing yeast company that was accused of buying German yeast, even though the bakers in the United States had a boycott against German yeast. It was a big to-do. And so in addition, though, Fleischmann's yeast was advertised as a cure for constipation. Now, if you know your Jewish stereotypes, you know that Jews stereotypically have stomach problems. And so to have Fleischmann's yeast there has that kind of double meaning about this Jewish stereotype, about stomach problems, and about the Jewish-owned company and these women who came from Eastern Europe. In fact, there's a prayer that we say after we use the restroom as Jews. We're so interested in how our bowels are doing. And stomach problems are also part of this comic strip. Also, this is a different version, a different parody of Dragnet that they did in 1954. And the final panel here is this Eastern European woman chasing her son, Willy Elder, who of course is Will Elder, the person who drew this. And where does she find him? She finds him in the only place where someone can find some privacy if you were an immigrant in the early part of the 20th century, and that's in the restroom. If any of you have been to the Lower East Side of New York, toured the Tenement Museum, or know about tenements, you know the bathroom is down the hall, and you have lots and lots of people living in each apartment, and this is really the only place where you can get some privacy. So this kind of a joke would have been readily apparent to Jewish readers, both the stomach problem issue and then this idea that you have somebody hiding in a bathroom because it's the only place where they can have some privacy. So I remember this stuff, actually. This is going to really embarrass my mom. When her mom, you can see my mom's reaction. This is great. When my grandma Yetta would come and visit us in Los Angeles, she lived in Culver City. All of a sudden, there would appear in our refrigerator a bottle of prune juice. And I was a little kid, and that was like dynamite. Like you did not want to touch that stuff, but you knew grandma was in town when the prune juice was in the refrigerator. So the whole stomach problem thing in Jews. So Mad Magazine changed the American language actually through their use of Yiddish and invented Yiddishisms. And as a consequence, readers would sometimes write in to the magazine and complain about the strange and exotic sounding words that appeared all over the magazine. So for instance, in this issue, we have this word for Schlugener. So Yiddish turned into English. To schlagen is to hit. Fur or far indicates that something takes the quality of that. And so for Schlugener means an old battered piece of junk. Now, what's interesting about this particular word is that this came into American English usage specifically because of Mad Magazine. They invent this word, they put it in the Mad Magazine strip, and all of a sudden it becomes part of the English language. Incredible power there. If you see here in this parody of Frankenstein, we have the word for schimmelt, which means confused, and then down below it for Schlugener, right there. We have it again in a parody of Alice in Wonderland. Let me add to this for Schlugener Place. And then we have other aspects of this. So this is a story that was really very, very clever. The regular story is on the left, and then they redid the same story, but they just put kind of nonsense things in all of the dialogue bubbles. But if you take a look at this dialogue bubble, there's some Yiddish there. So What Yiddish is it? I don't speak Yiddish, but I know this means the Danish king comes to a memorial in Copenhagen. Just totally off the wall. And if we go back to the previous, and then we have this one also in Frankenstein, where we have other Hebrew writing. As far as I could tell, this is just nonsense Hebrew. And then if we go back to the previous one, we have this word here, Rabbi, and there's a lot of disagreement about what this actually means. Jaffe says that it comes from an expression that he heard in Lithuania, Rabbi. So putz is a euphemism for genitals, and it's an insult directed at a rabbi, basically saying he's a stupid teacher. I apologize for bringing that into your collective knowledge this afternoon. And this appears all over the place in Mad Magazine also. Here's the Rabbi system of weights and measures, where we see that 1 for Schimmelt equals something else. There's a Flüssigler, and we have a halva and a blintz. Again, if you weren't Jewish and you didn't grow up in this environment of Yiddish kite, these words were probably nonsense words, and that just made all the sense in the world because Mad Magazine was full of these words all over the place. We also see it a little bit later. Don't you feel like a schmuck? Another Yiddish word, someone who is stupid, foolish, or obnoxious, and it's so vulgar that it was euphemized as schmo, as in G.I. schmo. So now we're going to get into a little bit of a different aspect of Mad Magazine, and that is its constant effort early on to counter Desemitization. And I would suspect that you have probably not heard the phrase Desemitization. So Desemitization started in the 1920s with the visible disappearance of Jews from film and other parts of popular culture. So this happened due to a rise in nativism, fears of anti-Semitic backlash against the disproportionate presence of Jews in Hollywood, and also self-censorship by the Jewish studio moguls. And it diminishes in the late 1950s when comedians like Alan Sherman and Lenny Bruce start to include specifically Jewish content in their comedy, especially Alan Sherman, because he was certainly more popular and more broadly popular than Lenny Bruce was. So Jewish Hollywood actors and studio heads changed their names for commercial reasons because they didn't want to incite anti-Semitism and further. They didn't think that their predominantly white working class audiences would want to watch Jews on screen. And so some of these might be familiar to you, how these stars changed their names. Tony Curtis, probably one we all know, and Kirk Douglas. The Three Stooges were not named Moe, Curly, and Larry. They were Moses, Jerome, and Louis. The Warner Brothers had last names that we would all struggle to pronounce. Same with Samuel Goldwyn and Mayer. Sid Caesar was the same. So let's pause at Sid Caesar. So the Jewish assimilationist environment into which Mad Magazine appeared can be put into context by thinking about Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows, which was on NBC from 1950 to 1954. Now you need to keep in mind that Mad Magazine #1 was published in 1952, right in the middle of Your Show of Shows run on NBC. So from the American Jewish perspective, the audience's perspective, there is nothing explicitly or even vaguely Jewish about Your Show of Shows. There are no Jewish jokes, no Jewish characters. The words Jew and Jewish are never spoken in the show. There's no Hebrew, almost no Yiddish, and anything that sounds like Yiddish is really presented as German. So the most Jewish aspect of Your Show of Shows wasn't that it looked Jewish, because what could be, actually, the most Jewish aspect of Your Show of Shows was that it didn't look Jewish. Because what could be more Jewish in assimilationist mid-20th century America than trying not to look Jewish. And of course, nearly everything about your show of shows was Jewish because almost all of the writers were Jewish. And they wrote for the New York Jewish television market. They would talk about how when they were putting it together, they're like, okay, we need to write some gags for the Jews in New York. So there was an episode in 1983 of the television show Nightcap, Conversations on the Arts and Letters, and Calvin Trillin was talking with some writers from this show. And Mel Brooks told Trillin that the writer's room for your show of shows was charged with competitive madness, was his phrase, where anger often led to humor. And so Brooks then shared that we were all going to psychiatrists. And Trillin asked Mel Brooks, was the same thing wrong with all of you? And Mel Brooks responds, yes, being Jewish. And a great example of this is this sketch, Big Business. You should find this on YouTube. It's 8 minutes long. And when you watch it and you think this was live television, 8 minutes long, you can't even imagine something like this happening today. But this is a great, great example. So Sid Caesar, who's standing there, orders lunch for his executives at the business that he owns. The lunch is delivered, and he realizes that there isn't a sandwich for him. They forgot his order. And of course, if you're Jewish, nothing creates more anxiety than not having enough food. And so there is nothing at all Jewish about this unless you're Jewish and you get the joke. So Mad reacts to this desemitization. Remember, desemitization is removing this Jewish presence from popular culture, from television, and from the movies. And Mad reacts to this by including Jewish and Jewish cultural references. So they start changing names. Batman and Robin becomes Batboy and Reuben. G.I. Joe becomes G.I. Schmo. We have a parody in 1969 of Rosemary's Baby. Here is the actor Ralph Bellamy, who is appearing in the movie as Dr. Abraham Saperstein. I cannot think of a more Jewish name than Abraham Saperstein, except that the guys at Mad Magazine could, and they turned him into Dr. Schlepperstein. And of course, a schlepper is somebody who kind of carries things. A beggar wanders aimlessly. This parody was written by a guy named Arnie Kogan, Jewish, born in Brooklyn. And unless lest you think that the writers and people at Mad Magazine were just a bunch of nincompoops, Arnie Kogan won 3 Emmy Awards for writing for the Carol Burnett Show. And looking around the room, I bet we all remember the Carol Burnett Show. I certainly do. So Mad reminded the Jewish community that no matter how much you want to hide your Jewishness, you simply can't do it. So here's a parody of Superman, Super Duper Man. And here, when he encounters Billy, who turns into Captain Marbles in this, all of a sudden Superman gets confused and he reverts to his mother tongue, Yiddish. And the trouble is that the joke here is for a Yiddish speaking reader who knows what's going on. And if you know even more of the joke, you know that Superman was created by these two guys, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who were 2 Jewish kids from Cleveland. So the more you know, the more historical context you have, the deeper these jokes go. And so let's take a look at a little specific Jewish content. Al Jaffe, who is still alive, almost 100 years old, he went to school with Will Elder. Isn't that an awesome picture? Can you imagine having a picture like that from 1936 of 2 guys who end up being artists at Mad Magazine? So he first appears in Mad Magazine in 1955. He's famous for the fold-in. This is great. This is from 1992. What's the only way for today's youth to ensure their financial stability? Moving back home. This is 1992. And if you've been following the news the last few years, this is what's in the news now, is how people in their 20s, late 20s, are starting to move back home because they can't afford to live on their own. So Al Jaffe was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1921. He has an incredible story that you should read. There was a biography written of him a few years ago. So his mother is basically insane. He characterizes himself as a reverse immigrant. So he's born in 1921 in the United States. In 1927, his mom takes himself and his brothers to this little shtetl, Zarasai in Lithuania. A year later, the dad brings everyone back to New York. A year later, the mom brings the sons back to the shtetl. 4 years later, the dad brings the older sons back to New York. The mom and the youngest son stay in Lithuania. They presumably die in the Holocaust. And so you can imagine that before Al Jaffe is even 10 years old, he has lived half his life in this little shtetl, half in like Brooklyn, and is just really, really messed up. So he was asked by an interviewer from the Forward a few years ago, why is there so much Yiddish in Mad Magazine? And Al Jaffe answers that he thinks in Yiddish and that Yiddish conveys humor better than English does. Here we have Larry Siegel. He also won a couple Emmys writing for the Carol Burnett Show. And he wrote in 1972, The Mad Religion in America Primer. And here you can see, what do Jews believe about Christ? They believe he's a nice Jewish boy who went into his father's business. And we have a little introduction to Judaism. Judaism is the oldest of the three religions. It's broken down into three major groups. First group observes ancient traditions to the letter. These are known as Orthodox Jews. The second group believes in combining ancient traditions with modern conditions. They are known as conservative Jews. The third group hardly observes any tradition at all. They are known as Reformed Jews. The other two groups, Reformed Jews have another name. They are known as Christians. And then the rabbi. This is the rabbi. He's a spiritual leader of his temple, and he is sad. Why is the rabbi sad? Because an important bar mitzvah has been postponed. Why has it been postponed? The rabbi is here. The bar mitzvah boy is here. The devout parents are here. The holy congregation is here. God is here. Well then, why was the bar mitzvah postponed? Because the caterer didn't show up. How much suffering can Jews stand? Then we have Dave Berg, also Jewish. How can you not be with a name like Berg? He often drew self-portraits or caricatures of himself in his humor. And his main character was this guy, Roger Kaputnik. And of course, we know that kaput means lost, dead, useless, destroyed. And so for most people, you know, if you read Mad Magazine and you still have friends from when you were a kid and those friends aren't Jewish, send them this and say, hey, Joe, when we were reading this and you saw this name, what did you think? He'll say, just a silly, stupid name. And you'd say, well, I'm Jewish and I know it's not because I have the inside scoop about what's going on in Mad Magazine. Here we have two people who get married. Neither of them are Jewish, but they want to compromise. So what do? They get married in a Jewish synagogue. Now, these guys aren't just really disparaging Judaism. Dave Berg also wrote this book, My Friend God. You don't have to be Jewish, but it helps. And we're going to read just a couple passages from it. In the beginning, God created. What's that, you ask? Who is God? I'm talking about my friend God. When's the last time I saw God? Well, the astronauts just saw God on the last shuttle mission and she's black. Okay, so maybe that's a joke, maybe. But my friend God isn't a she or a he, and that he stuff in the Bible is only because a he is just an it. Not all men are its, but my friend God is not a sex or a color, just a shade called friend. And you can ask your rabbi next time you're doing your Shabbat morning study session how this compares to the early part of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, the book of knowledge, because this stuff is right out of Maimonides. There is no, never shall be any, there never shall be any such an animal as anti-Semitism. There is, was, and will only be such a monster as anti-peopleism. I don't know how many of us would agree with this today with the rise of anti-Semitism, but there it is. Now, Dave Berg also spent some of his time drawing for Moshiach Times, which is a publication of the Chabad Lubavitch movement. And Jaffe did the same thing. Spy was a character who helps innocent people save ancient traditions that are in danger of being lost. So one of the most fascinating things that's going on with Mad Magazine is how they approach Hitler and the Holocaust, because many of these artists and writers were Jewish. Many had served in the military. Many had been from Eastern Europe. And so here, when early on, Will Elder draws Frankenstein, how is he going to depict the Frankenstein monster? Well, as the worst thing that anyone could imagine, and that would be as Hitler. Mad parodied the 1951 play, and it was a 1953 movie, Stalag 17 as Stalag 18. Here you see we have the word for Schligener, as in the past, and of course 18 refers to Chai, which is life. But the real serious stuff doesn't happen until 1967, and that's when Mad Magazine parodied Hogan's Heroes. So Hogan's Heroes, you'll remember, ran between 1965 and 1971. And Larry Siegel was the writer of this, and he said about Hogan's Heroes, I resented the fact that they were making the Germans so cute, and these guys were sitting in prison. I was over there and I saw what it was really like. And so here we have a splash page of Hogan's Heroes. You can see Bob Crane's character at the bottom there. And so what MAD does is it takes this POW, Second World War POW sitcom, and takes it to its logical conclusion, you might think. And so they have this 3 pages of this Hogan's Heroes parody. And then on the last page, they just have this one splash page, which turns the same scene into something from a concentration camp. And they turned it into basically an American Jewish summer camp scene. So you can see here, what are they saying? What a fun concentration camp this Buchenwald is. You bet, it's fun, 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 day and night without let up. I've been in some fantastic German concentration camps, but this one is by far the most fantastic of all. Every night I thank God for the pleasure he's given Jews like me during World War II. When I think of how close Hitler got to being killed in that bomb plot, bite your tongue. Herr Hochman, your inmate baseball team is terrible. You know what? I think I'll send your pitcher to the showers. Get it? Showers. Commandant, you know what? You're a gasser. Do you dig? A real gasser. Wait till you see the latest gag we're going to pull over on the guards over at the crematorium. Boy, it's a hot one. Oh, the laughs come a mile a minute on this show. This is much funnier than Hogan's Heroes ever was. Have you seen the latest Nielsen's? We've got a higher rating than the Pope's visit to New York last year, and that was on every TV channel. Yes, sir, this is American television humor at its best. So we have quite an interesting take on Hogan's Heroes, and if you recall how I started our hour together with the idea of what makes something funny, it needs to be a benign violation. You need to figure out whether this is funny. Is this too much of a violation? Is it not benign enough for it to be funny? Or is there some mitigating situation here, simply the fact that we're still alive and Hitler isn't, and that maybe being able to make fun of Hitler in the Holocaust is the rightful conclusion for the American Jewish community and Jews around the world. So we're going to finish up with just this picture here from 2012. This is Al Jaffe. What if Batman were Jewish? I actually start a class that I teach at the University of Houston with this, and we spend about 45 minutes trying to figure out this splash page. You can see a number of things. There's a race on Robin's suit. Batman is wearing tefillin and a tallis. His utility belt has matzo balls and gefilte fish. We have the International House of Potato Pancakes. And then there are a few really obscure things. And again, this is the stuff that I love about it, because it shows you that you really need to understand more than just being able to read a joke and getting it the first time. So one of the more sophisticated things is the mezuzah to the bat cave. Of course, if you're sharp enough, you know that it's on the wrong side. It should be on the other side that's outside of the picture, because it's on the right as you enter a room leaning in. The other thing is that we have these 10 things. I think they're 10 things. What if Batman were Jewish? He'd forbid the lighting of the bat signal on Shabbat. Okay, so that's pretty easy to get. He'd pester Aquaman to set him up with a lifetime supply of gefilte fish. That's funny too. Now, some of them are really very sophisticated. So for instance, right in the middle, he'd quit the Justice League to join the Jewish Defense League. Now, first of all, you need to know that the Justice League is the DC Comics universe of characters, Aquaman, Batman, Superman, people like that. But then you also need to know the Jewish Defense League, and you need to know that that's an actual thing. Started in the 1960s and 70s. Meir Kahane started it up and is listed as a terrorist organization by the FBI here in the United States, started by working on behalf of Soviet Jews and then became very militant in other ways. So then we'd have, toward the end, he'd commission the world's largest mezuzah for the entrance to the Bat Cave. So that's a little tour of Mad Magazine, here we go. And now I think we have, probably a little less than 10 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, I talked fast and talked a lot. Feel free to just unmute yourself and we'll see if I can make up an answer for you.
That was great. Thank you. You didn't talk about Alfred E. Newman. Was Alfred supposed to be Jewish?
So I've looked into that a little bit, and as far as I can tell, no. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but I do remember I looked into it. I think the etymology of the Alfred E. Newman character exists outside of the Jewish world. And that character actually is based on a previous caricature that appears in different publications, dating back to the early part of the 20th century, I believe.
Didn't Alfred E. Newman always say, "What, me worry?"
Yep.
Definitely not
He's
Jewish.
not Jewish if he's
Very good point. Very good point. Yes.
the smart one in my family is my wife. She came up with that.
Anyone else have a question?
You talked about Jewish actors. What about Audie Murphy? Does he change what was his original name?
I don't know.
Because I'm pretty
That's
sure.
a great question. That's
your
why we have
recollection,
the internet.
like mine, Audie Murphy was Jewish, right?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can both repair the internet afterwards and go look.
Okay, sounds good.
What was the reaction in the early 50s by the non-Jewish public when the magazine first came out? Was there any reaction one way or the other?
It was widely embraced. There was, I don't really know exactly, but I know that it continued with some semblance of profitability without advertising until 2001. So they were making enough money to keep it going based on newsstand sales and then later through subscriptions. I had a subscription to Mad Magazine probably between the ages of, 11 and 13 or 14, something like that. Anyone else?
You said about the lack of Jewish humor on TV. So where would you put the Milton Berle show? With I got a coat with a belt on the back, that kind of all that shtick.
So I don't know enough about Milton Berle and about the Milton Berle show. Although I'll tell you, I actually did go to high school with his son, Bill Berle. He was in my class. But my hunch about that is that things that we see as Jewish, other people, like, it doesn't occur to them for it to be Jewish. And the other thing to remember is that other cultural groups can appropriate the same humor. What makes a Jewish joke Jewish? There's a rabbi in the joke, right? What makes the same joke Catholic? It's a priest instead of a rabbi who walks into the bar and says such and such. So I think some of it has to do with a sense of pride about our cultural identity. And when you have pride about your cultural identity, you impose that pride on things that you see in the world around you. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of what happens with a show like you're suggesting, because people will see in it a piece of themselves. And unless they have that direct connection and maybe some behind the scenes knowledge, like you would know that all the writers on your show were Jewish, they might not think that it's a Jewish joke that isn't intended for them.
The picture that you put up of the plate that was called Shadow,
Yes.
the so-called criminals in there, it caught my eye. They all had hooked noses. They all looked, I mean, to me, it looked like, no, not that one.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to,
Okay.
whoops, where'd it go? Am I still, oops, screen
No,
sharing
you're not
stopped.
sharing.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, that one. Yep. So I was those on the right, I mean, to me, it was like a caricature from Der Stürmer, that it looked like the eternal Jew, the things that you used to see in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'll tell you, that has never struck me in that way. But you're correct. My hunch would be it's one of two things. Either, and I think it's probably more likely that you see a Jewish caricature when you're looking for the Jewish caricature. But if you're not looking for the Jewish caricature, you just see an evil criminal caricature. Now, of course, the evil criminal caricature comes from an initial caricature of a Jew with a big nose because Jews are evil. But that would be my sense. And so Will Elder, of course, who is Jewish, is probably drawing from that. Now, the other side of it, though, might be the idea that offensive jokes that are offensive to a particular cultural community, are not offensive if they are expressed and shared only within that community. When I was in college, I lived in a dorm at UC San Diego, and there were a bunch of Jews in the dorm, and we would refer to each other as Heb, right? Hebrew, Heb. That would be offensive if somebody else yelled that to you on the playground, right? But among ourselves, it was, a expression of affection instead. So it might be that he's also using this kind of as an inside joke in the same way that they can parody the Holocaust in a concentration camp.
Mm.
Hmm.
We have a couple more minutes. Any other questions?